That was not just an ordinary flight. It was supposed to be a peaceful journey, a moment of anticipation and excitement for Olivia and her husband James. Olivia, 7 months pregnant, had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. It was a short flight, nothing too demanding, but every little thing mattered to her now. Her comfort, her safety, everything was heightened because she wasn't just traveling for herself anymore. She was carrying life inside her. James had booked first-class seats for her, making sure she had enough space to stretch her legs and relax. He always made sure she was taken care of, never letting her lift a finger when she didn't have to. But today, something felt different. Maybe it was the tension in the air or the way people were moving around the airport, distracted and hurried. Olivia brushed it off, assuming it was just another busy day at the terminal. As they boarded the plane, James kissed her forehead and helped her settle into her seat before stepping away to take a quick phone call. He was always handling business, but Olivia never minded. She knew the kind of man she had married: focused, determined, and kind-hearted. She adjusted her seatbelt, her hands resting gently on her belly. That's when she noticed the flight attendant approaching. The woman, dressed in her crisp uniform, looked professional at first glance. But there was something in her eyes, an edge, a sharpness, that didn't sit right. Olivia barely had time to process it before the flight attendant's voice cut through the air. "Excuse me, ma'am, I think you're in the wrong section." Olivia looked up, confused. "No, my husband booked these seats for us." The flight attendant gave her a tight-lipped smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm going to need to see your ticket." Olivia shifted slightly, reaching into her purse. She knew how this worked. Sometimes airlines double-checked, especially in first class. She handed over her ticket, expecting the woman to simply confirm it and move on. But instead, the attendant barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "There must be a mistake," she said. "You need to move to economy." A few nearby passengers glanced over. Olivia felt a flush of embarrassment but kept her voice steady. "No, there's no mistake. This is my seat." The flight attendant's expression hardened. "Ma'am, I don't have time for this. You need to move." Olivia felt the heat rise in her chest. She had encountered rude people before, but this was different. She wasn't just being asked to move. She was being dismissed, as if she didn't belong here. "I'm sorry, but I'm not moving," Olivia said, her voice firm. The flight attendant's patience snapped. Without warning, she reached forward and grabbed Olivia's arm. "I said move." And then, in a moment that left the entire cabin silent, the flight attendant's hand struck Olivia's cheek. Gasps filled the air. A man in the next row dropped his drink. A woman clutched her pearls in shock. The cabin crew nearby froze, as if time itself had stopped. Olivia's hand went to her face, her skin stinging from the slap. And then, before Olivia could even react, before she could even process what had just happened, she heard the deep, familiar voice behind her. A voice that was no longer calm. "What did you just do?" James had returned, and the look in his eyes sent a chill through the air. The flight attendant turned to face him, still looking annoyed, as if she were about to scold another passenger. But the moment she saw his face, something changed. Because James wasn't just any man. He was the owner of the entire airline. The moment James spoke, the flight attendant's face shifted. The irritation that had been so clear just seconds ago flickered into something else. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. She hesitated, her lips parting as if searching for words, but nothing came out. The entire first-class cabin was silent now, all eyes bouncing between James, Olivia, and the woman who had just made the worst mistake of her career. James stepped closer, his presence commanding. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to raise his voice to be heard. His expression alone spoke volumes. Olivia could feel the tension in his body even though he wasn't touching her. His jaw was locked, his eyes dark with anger, but his voice remained controlled. "Did you just put your hands on my wife?" The flight attendant's mouth opened and closed like she wanted to deny it, but too many people had seen what happened. The mark on Olivia's cheek was proof enough. The woman took a shaky breath, quickly shifting back to the attitude she had started with, as if trying to regain control. "Sir, I was just enforcing policy," she said, her voice a little weaker now. She refused to move to her correct seat, and James cut her off. "Her correct seat?" His voice was laced with disbelief. He turned to Olivia. "Did she even check your ticket?" Olivia swallowed, still feeling the heat on her face. "Barely." James turned back to the flight attendant, his expression unreadable now. "So you assumed she didn't belong here?" The woman bristled, glancing around at the passengers who were still watching. "Sir, I was just doing my job." James let out a slow breath, tilting his head slightly. "Your job includes hitting passengers?" The woman stiffened, her hands gripping the edge of the seat beside her. I didn't mean." James took another step closer, lowering his voice. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" The flight attendant blinked, confused. For the first time, real panic flashed in her eyes. She glanced at the other crew members, as if expecting someone to step in and help, but they all looked just as uneasy. James pulled out his phone, his fingers moving swiftly over the screen. He barely looked at it as he spoke again. "You just assaulted my wife in front of an entire cabin full of witnesses." His voice remained low, calm, but there was something lethal about it. "Tell me, how exactly do you think this ends for you?" The woman's breath hitched. "Sir, please, I wasn't thinking." James lifted a hand, silencing her. "That much is clear." Olivia, who had remained quiet, finally found her voice. "I don't want to argue," she said, her tone steady but laced with hurt. "I just want to sit in the seat my husband booked for me." James turned to her, his expression softening for just a moment. His hand brushed gently over her cheek, the touch light, careful. It was such a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. The flight attendant watched the exchange, her face growing pale as realization settled in. "Sir, who are you?" James exhaled slowly and slipped his phone back into his pocket. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but held enough weight to send chills down the woman's spine. "I own this airline." The words landed like a thunderclap. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. The passengers who had been silently watching suddenly shifted, eyes widening as they took in the situation from a new perspective. The flight attendant's entire body tensed. Her eyes darted to the other crew members, but none of them stepped in to help. They weren't going to save her from this. They knew better. I didn't know," she stammered, her confidence gone. James let out a humorless chuckle. "You didn't bother to find out." The silence stretched between them. The woman looked like she wanted to disappear. A different flight attendant finally stepped forward, a man with graying hair and a more professional demeanor. His name tag read Patrick. He had been standing nearby the whole time, and while he hadn't interfered before, he seemed to understand that now was the moment to step in. "Mr. Carter," Patrick said carefully, addressing James with the respect he clearly deserved, "I deeply apologize for what just happened. This is not how we treat our passengers." James didn't take his eyes off the woman who had struck Olivia. "Are you her supervisor?" Patrick nodded once. "Yes, sir." James took another slow breath, as if considering his next move. He wasn't the kind of man to act out of impulse. Even in his anger, he remained composed, deliberate. That was what made him so powerful. He turned to Patrick. "Remove her from this flight." The flight attendant's eyes widened in horror. "Sir, please. I need this job." James raised a hand again, his patience clearly gone. "And my wife needed respect. You made your choice." Patrick didn't hesitate. He nodded to another crew member, who immediately moved toward the woman, gesturing for her to step aside. Her face crumpled, but she knew there was no way out of this. Without another word, she turned and hurried down the aisle, her head low, her uniform stiff with tension. The moment she disappeared, James exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face before turning back to Olivia. "Are you okay?" She nodded, but James could see the way she held herself, the way she kept a hand protectively over her belly. He hated that she had to experience this. Hated that even with all the precautions he took, with all the power he had, she had still been made to feel small. Patrick cleared his throat. "Again, Mr. Carter, I sincerely apologize." James nodded once. "Make sure it doesn't happen again." Patrick bowed his head slightly before stepping away to handle the rest of the crew. James sat beside Olivia, taking her hand in his. He could still feel the slight tremble in her fingers. "Are you sure you're okay?" he asked again, quieter this time. Olivia let out a slow breath. "I am now." James squeezed her hand gently, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "It won't happen again," he promised. And James Carter was not a man who made promises lightly. The hum of the airplane engines filled the silence that followed. Olivia shifted in her seat, still feeling the lingering heat on her cheek. James hadn't let go of her hand, his grip firm yet gentle, as if he was silently reassuring her that she was safe now. But Olivia could see it in his eyes. This wasn't over for him. James wasn't the kind of man to let things slide, especially when it came to her. She stole a glance around the cabin. Some passengers were still watching, others quickly averted their gaze the moment she met their eyes. Whispers floated through the air, soft but unmistakable. It wasn't every day that someone saw the owner of an airline personally remove a flight attendant from a plane. A young woman sitting across the aisle leaned in slightly, her voice cautious but filled with concern. "Are you okay?" Olivia nodded, managing a small smile. "I'm fine. Thank you." The woman hesitated before speaking again. "That was awful. I mean, I don't even know what to say. She had no right to do that." James glanced at her, giving a polite nod. "You saw everything?" She nodded quickly. "Yes. I saw the way she looked at your wife even before she spoke. Like she had already made up her mind about her." The woman sighed, shaking her head. "I work in customer service, and I can tell when someone isn't just enforcing rules. She wasn't being professional, she was being cruel." James took in the woman's words, his expression unreadable. "What's your name?" "Sophia," she answered, sitting up straighter. "Sophia Ramirez." James seemed to commit it to memory before responding. "Thank you, Sophia." The conversation ended there, but Olivia could tell James was filing away every detail, every witness, every piece of information. She squeezed his hand, bringing his focus back to her. "James, I just want to move on from this." His jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "I know." Yet she also knew that wasn't the end of it. Not for him. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Olivia leaned back in her seat, trying to relax. But it was difficult. The adrenaline from the confrontation still rushed through her veins, making it hard to settle. Her baby kicked softly, as if sensing the unease. She rubbed her belly absent-mindedly, whispering, "It's okay, little one. We're okay." James watched her, his expression softening for a brief moment before his phone vibrated. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. Olivia saw the name flash across. Marcus. His right-hand man, the one who handled high-level business matters when James couldn't. James exhaled through his nose before answering. "Tell me you have something." Even though Olivia couldn't hear Marcus on the other end, she knew what the conversation was about. James had sent that text earlier, likely demanding a full report on the flight attendant. James' expression didn't change as he listened. Then, after a few moments, he spoke again. "I want her employment records reviewed immediately. Any prior complaints, any history of misconduct, find everything. He paused. And have legal take a look at this. I want to know what options we have. Olivia sighed softly, nudging his arm. James. He met her eyes, his expression unreadable for a beat before he relented. I'll handle it later. The plane lifted off the ground, climbing into the sky. Olivia tried to focus on the view outside the window, but her thoughts kept drifting. This wasn't the first time she had faced something like this. It wasn't even the first time James had been forced to step in. It was exhausting, always having to prove herself, always being questioned in spaces where she rightfully belonged. James had always told her that as long as he had power, he would use it to protect her. But Olivia also knew that his power came with a cost. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a man who built an empire from the ground up. People envied him, challenged him, and sometimes, they tried to bring him down. This flight attendant might not have known who James was, but Olivia wondered, who else on this flight did? Because something about the whole situation didn't sit right. She replayed the moment in her head. The way the woman had approached her, the immediate hostility, the sheer confidence she had in trying to remove her without even checking properly. It almost felt intentional. She glanced at James again, debating whether to voice her thoughts. But before she could say anything, one of the remaining flight attendants approached cautiously. This one was younger, with nervous energy radiating from her. Mr. Carter, she said softly, clasping her hands in front of her. I just wanted to personally apologize on behalf of the crew for what happened earlier. That was unacceptable, and it doesn't reflect the values of our airline. James gave a small nod. What's your name? Lisa, she answered quickly. I've worked here for 3 years, and I've never seen something like that before. She hesitated before lowering her voice. I just thought you should know that she wasn't acting alone. Olivia and James exchanged a look. Lisa glanced around nervously before continuing. Before the flight, I overheard her talking to someone on the phone. She was saying something about making sure she didn't get comfortable, and how people like her didn't belong in first class. Olivia's stomach dropped. James' expression darkened, his entire demeanor shifting into something colder. Did she say who she was talking to? Lisa shook her head. No, but she was acting strange. And when I saw what happened earlier, I just thought you should know. James inhaled deeply, as if holding something back. He gave a slow nod. Thank you for telling me, Lisa. The young woman quickly stepped away, leaving Olivia and James in heavy silence. Olivia swallowed hard. James, this wasn't random, was it? James' fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, his mind already working through the possibilities. No, he murmured. It wasn't. A chill ran down Olivia's spine. James leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Someone wanted to make a statement, and they used her to do it. The question now was, who and why? As the plane continued through the sky, Olivia could feel the weight of something bigger pressing down on them. This wasn't over. Not even close. The plane cruised at a steady altitude, but inside the cabin, the tension was anything but steady. Olivia sat quietly, her fingers still resting on her stomach, though her mind raced with possibilities. James hadn't spoken for the last few minutes, which told her everything she needed to know. He was thinking, calculating. He always did this when something didn't add up. She studied him, the way his jaw tensed ever so slightly, the way his fingers tapped against the armrest in a slow, controlled rhythm. James was a man who built his empire by always being 2 steps ahead. And right now, Olivia could tell, he was putting the pieces together. Her own unease grew with each passing second. This wasn't just a case of a rude flight attendant overstepping her authority. Lisa's words echoed in her mind. She wasn't acting alone. James suddenly leaned forward, pulling his phone out again. He tapped the screen a few times, and Olivia could see a text thread open with Marcus. James. Find out who she was talking to before the flight. Get security footage from the terminal if you have to. Seconds later, the typing bubbles appeared. Marcus. Already on it. But there's something else you should know. James' grip on the phone tightened slightly. Olivia could sense it before he even spoke. What is it? She asked, keeping her voice low. James exhaled sharply, still reading the message. Marcus says the flight attendant, her name's Deborah Miller, has been with the airline for over a decade. No major incidents on her record. Olivia frowned. Then why now? Why risk everything today? James looked at her, his expression unreadable. Because she thought she was protected. Olivia shivered. The way he said it, so certain, so final. James continued, his voice quieter now. Marcus pulled her call logs from the airline records. He paused. She was in contact with someone from a private number just before boarding. Olivia's breath caught. You think someone put her up to this? James' gaze darkened. I don't think. I know. A rush of anxiety tightened Olivia's chest. She thought about the way the flight attendant had looked at her, the hostility in her voice, the sheer confidence with which she had acted. This wasn't just some random act of aggression. It had been planned. James was already dialing Marcus. Olivia listened as his voice dropped into that calm, controlled tone he used when things were serious. Who does the number belong to? Marcus' voice was too low to hear, but whatever he said made James' entire posture change. His back straightened, his fingers flexing around the phone before he slowly exhaled. Of course, he muttered. Olivia leaned in. James? He didn't answer right away. He ended the call and slipped his phone back into his pocket. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, but there was something sharp beneath the surface. I know who's behind this. Olivia's stomach twisted. Who? James glanced around, making sure no one else was listening before he turned back to her. Daniel Prescott. The name hit Olivia like a weight. Daniel Prescott. A name she hadn't heard in a long time, but one that still carried a sting. A rival businessman, someone who had tried, and failed, to challenge James in the corporate world. James had shut down one of Prescott's major business ventures months ago, exposing shady dealings and unethical practices. It had been a brutal but necessary takedown. Prescott hadn't just lost money, he'd lost influence, power. And now, it seemed, he was trying to settle the score. Olivia swallowed hard. You think he sent her to humiliate me? To cause a scene? James' expression was unreadable, but his voice was firm. I think he wanted to make a statement, to remind me that he's still a problem. His eyes darkened. But he made a mistake. Olivia didn't need to ask what he meant. Prescott had tried to hurt James in the worst way possible, by targeting her. And if there was one thing she knew about her husband, it was that he didn't take threats lightly. As the weight of the situation settled in, Olivia suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. She glanced around the cabin again. Had Prescott placed someone else on this flight? Was someone still watching them? She reached for James' hand, squeezing it. What do we do? James didn't hesitate. We land. And then I deal with Prescott myself. The finality in his voice sent a chill down Olivia's spine. She knew James. He wouldn't let this go. But as she sat there, heart pounding, she had the distinct feeling that Prescott wasn't finished yet. And whatever came next would be even worse. Olivia kept her grip on James' hand, her pulse quickening. The weight of what they had just uncovered sat heavy between them, but something in her gut told her this wasn't the end of it. If Daniel Prescott had orchestrated this, if he had gone through all the trouble of setting up such a calculated public humiliation, then why did it feel like they were still missing something? She could see the way James' mind was working. He was quiet. Too quiet. James wasn't the kind of man to let emotions dictate his next move. He was always thinking ahead, preparing for every possibility. The seatbelt sign flickered on as the captain announced their descent. Olivia tried to focus on the outside world, the city lights growing closer beneath them, but her nerves refused to settle. James was already texting again, his fingers moving with controlled urgency. James. Have security meet us at the gate. Get ahead of this. Marcus' reply came almost instantly. Marcus. Already in motion. But James. You need to see this. James frowned, the tension in his face deepening as he clicked on the link Marcus sent. Olivia watched as his brows furrowed, his jaw tightening slightly. Then, without a word, he turned his phone toward her. Her stomach dropped. It was a news article, and their names were already in the headline. Billionaire airline owner caught in first-class scandal. Pregnant wife involved in heated incident with flight attendant. Olivia's blood ran cold as she skimmed the article. It painted the flight attendant as a dedicated worker just doing her job, while Olivia was portrayed as an entitled passenger who had refused to comply with airline policies. The headline alone was damaging, but the worst part? It was already trending. James cursed under his breath. They were ready for this. Olivia felt her pulse hammering. This wasn't just about humiliation. Prescott hadn't just wanted to rattle them. He wanted to control the narrative. He had moved fast, pushing a story that twisted the truth before they even landed. James clenched his jaw. They had this waiting. This was never just about the flight. It was about what happened after. Olivia swallowed hard. They wanted the world to see it before we could say anything. James didn't answer right away. His mind was working, pulling apart every angle, every move Prescott had made. Then, another vibration from his phone. Another message. Marcus. It's worse. The article links back to a source, someone claiming to have inside information on the airline's biased policies. And that someone? Deborah Miller. Olivia's breath caught. She's talking to the press? James exhaled sharply, his entire demeanor shifting into something colder, more controlled. She's not just talking. She's selling a story. The pieces fell into place too fast for Olivia to keep up. This had never been about a single moment of disrespect. Prescott had planted Deborah, knowing she would escalate a situation, knowing it would turn into a spectacle. And the second it did, he made sure the media was waiting. Olivia gripped her armrest, trying to steady herself. James, how do we stop this? He was already moving to the next step. His fingers tapped against the screen as he fired off another text. James, get our legal team on this now. We go public before they control the whole story. Marcus' reply came fast. Marcus, already drafting a statement. But there's something else. James' grip on the phone tightened. Olivia braced herself as he read the next message, his face shifting from tense to unreadable. Then he turned to her, voice low. There's another piece of the article coming. Olivia's stomach twisted. What? James exhaled slowly, steadying himself. They're not just attacking you. He hesitated before finishing. They're going after me. Olivia's chest tightened. What do you mean? James turned the phone toward her again. A preview of the next article. A headline that sent a chill down her spine. Anonymous insider alleges corruption at Carter Airlines. James Carter under investigation? Her breath caught. This wasn't just a smear campaign against her anymore. This was an attempt to destroy James. The plane touched down, but Olivia barely noticed. Because suddenly, everything had changed. And whatever came next was about to be worse than they ever imagined. The moment the plane's wheels hit the runway, James was already unbuckling his seatbelt. His movements were calm, controlled, but Olivia could see the fire burning just beneath the surface. He wasn't just angry, he was calculating his next move. She took a deep breath, her mind still racing from everything they had just uncovered. The media storm was already brewing, and if they didn't act fast, Prescott's version of the story would be the only one the world believed. As they taxied to the gate, James leaned closer to her. "Stay by my side. No matter what happens when we step off this plane." Olivia nodded, her fingers tightening around his. She could see the tension in his posture, the way his mind was already steps ahead. He wasn't just reacting to the attack, he was preparing to end it. The moment the aircraft door opened, a group of security personnel was already waiting. Marcus stood at the front, his face unreadable, but the look in his eyes told Olivia everything. Things had escalated even further in the last few minutes. "James," Marcus said as they stepped into the jet bridge. "We have a problem." James didn't even break stride. "I already know about the next article." "What else?" Marcus handed him a tablet. "Prescott isn't just feeding the media a story, he's trying to make it real. He sent an anonymous tip to regulators, claiming you've been hiding financial misconduct within the airline. The authorities are looking into it." Olivia sucked in a breath. This was worse than she thought. If Prescott had managed to plant the right rumors, even the smallest inquiry could damage James' reputation. But James simply exhaled, his voice steady. "Let them look. They won't find anything." Marcus nodded but hesitated before speaking again. "There's more. Deborah Miller isn't alone in this. She's been in contact with at least 2 other employees. I think they were paid off to make statements against you." Olivia's heart pounded. "So, they're building a full case?" James finally stopped walking. He turned to Marcus, his expression unreadable. "Then it's time we give them something they weren't expecting." Marcus met his gaze, understanding passing between them. Then he handed James another file. "This just came in. We dug into Prescott's financials." Marcus hesitated, then added, "And we found something." James opened the file, his eyes scanning the contents. Olivia watched as his jaw tensed, his grip on the pages tightening slightly. Then, for the first time that night, a slow, knowing smile spread across his face. Olivia leaned closer. "James?" He turned to her, his voice calm but edged with quiet victory. "Prescott's been playing dirty for years. He must have thought we'd never look." Olivia frowned. "What do you mean?" James handed her the file. She scanned the pages, her eyes widening as she realized what she was looking at. Prescott had been laundering money through shell companies, illegal transactions that would ruin him if they ever came to light. James turned back to Marcus. "Leak it. But not all at once." Marcus nodded. "Just enough to make him panic?" James smirked. "Exactly." Olivia felt a shiver run down her spine. This wasn't just a counterattack. It was a complete reversal. Prescott had thought he could control the story, manipulate the media, and destroy James. But now, the trap had turned on him. As they stepped out into the airport, the flashes of cameras surrounded them. Reporters shouted questions, microphones pushed forward, but James didn't stop. He squeezed Olivia's hand gently and whispered, "Watch." Within minutes, Marcus sent out the first leak. A single report, carefully worded, exposing a hint of Prescott's illegal dealings. The reaction was immediate. Phones buzzed, reporters murmured, and then, just as James predicted, Prescott himself was forced to respond. A frantic statement denying everything. A desperate attempt to shift attention. And then, the final blow. James turned to Olivia, his voice low and sure. "By the time we wake up tomorrow, Prescott won't just be defending himself in the press. He'll be answering to the law." Olivia exhaled, her pulse finally slowing. It was over. Prescott had played his hand, and James had made sure it was his last move. The tension in the air slowly began to dissolve as they walked through the airport, security keeping the aggressive reporters at bay. Olivia held James' hand tightly, her body still buzzing from everything that had happened. The flashes, the whispers, the chaos. It was all a reminder of just how close they had come to losing control of the story. But now, things were different. Prescott was the one scrambling, his carefully laid plan falling apart right in front of him. As they stepped outside, a black SUV was already waiting for them. Marcus opened the door, and James helped Olivia inside before sliding in next to her. The moment the doors shut, the noise from the crowd faded, replaced by a heavy silence. James turned to Marcus. "How bad is the fallout?" Marcus glanced down at his phone, checking the latest updates. "It's unraveling faster than I expected. The media's already picked up the story on Prescott's finances, and there's talk that an official investigation is being launched. He's trying to do damage control, but it's not working. Too many people are coming forward now." Olivia let out a slow breath, relief washing over her. "So, it's over?" James looked at her, his expression softening. "Almost." She frowned. "What else is left?" James glanced at Marcus before answering. "We still need to deal with Deborah Miller." Marcus nodded. "She's already been fired. But she's still pushing her version of the story. It won't hold for long though. Too many passengers witnessed what actually happened. We've got statements, security footage, and now, the truth about who was really behind it all." Olivia exhaled, shaking her head. "It's just hard to believe someone would go so far just to bring you down." James reached for her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "People like Prescott think power gives them control over everything. But the mistake they always make is underestimating the people they try to step on." Olivia gave a small smile, squeezing his hand. "Well, he definitely underestimated us." Marcus smirked. "That's putting it lightly. By morning, he'll be lucky if he still has a company to run." The car ride back to their home was quiet, but for the first time since the flight, Olivia felt like she could breathe. The storm had come, but they had weathered it. Later that night, as she sat in their living room, curled up on the couch, she scrolled through the latest headlines. Prescott's empire was crumbling in real time. Investors were pulling out, employees were speaking up, and the legal troubles were only beginning. James walked in, a glass of water in hand, and sat beside her. "Still keeping up with it?" She looked up at him and sighed. "I guess I just need to see it through." He smiled softly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You already know how it ends." She set her phone down and leaned against him. "I just don't want this to happen to anyone else." James kissed the top of her head. "It won't. People like Prescott don't get away with things forever. Eventually, the truth catches up." Olivia smiled. "And you made sure of that." James chuckled. "We made sure of that." A comfortable silence settled between them. The chaos, the stress, the uncertainty, it was all behind them now. As Olivia closed her eyes, she realized something. She hadn't just survived this. She had won.